He woke up 46 years too early. That was the first thought that passed through Marcus Cole's mind as the cryo chamber hissed open and cold air rushed into his lungs like a fist. His body refused to cooperate, fingers curling uselessly, legs locked rigid, vision a washed-out white that refused to sharpen into anything useful. The system was not supposed to wake him. Not here. Not now. The digital readout on the chamber wall blinked once, twice, and then settled on a number that made his stomach drop through the floor of the ship. Mission elapsed time, 4 years, 2 months, 14 days. He read it again, then again. His cryo-fogged brain ran the calculation 3 times before it would accept the result. 4 years, not 50. He was supposed to sleep for 50 years, sealed in a pod while the universe aged around him, and the Earth he had left behind was slowly, methodically destroyed. He should be waking up to a new sun and a new sky, not the cold, recycled air of a ship still in transit. He should not be awake at all. He pulled himself out of the chamber, muscles screaming in protest, and grabbed the edge of the observation console. The stars on the exterior display were wrong. The constellations had shifted, not by 50 years of travel, not by the expected stellar drift, but by just enough to confirm something that should have been physically impossible. The navigation readout glowed in blue letters above the viewport. Destination confirmed, Proxima Centauri B. He stared at that line until his vision stopped swimming. Proxima Centauri B. That was the destination. That had always been the destination. But the math, the brutal, unforgiving math of interstellar travel that every physicist on Earth had agreed upon before the Exodus fleet launched, said the journey required 50 years at the speeds available to human engineering. 50 years of hibernation, 50 years of silent, frozen transit through the void. 4 years was not possible. Something had moved the ship. Marcus pushed off the console and made his way down the corridor toward the crew bay, half walking, half sliding along the handrails as his body slowly remembered what being alive felt like. The bay held 980 cryopods arranged in stacked rows, each one sealed and frosted, the soft amber light of active stasis glowing from every status panel. He stopped at the nearest control terminal and typed in his command override. Wake sequence. Initiated. Access denied. He tried again. Same result. He tried the captain's secondary code, a 6-digit sequence he had memorized during the pre-launch briefings as backup protocol. Access denied. He tried the medical emergency override, which should have worked under any circumstances short of a catastrophic hull failure. Access denied. Someone had locked him out of his own ship. He stood in the middle of that corridor, surrounded by nearly 1,000 sleeping human beings, including her, and felt something cold settle in the pit of his stomach that had nothing to do with the residual chill of cryogenic sleep. He was the mission commander. There was no authority above his on this vessel. There was no protocol that could supersede his access. He had been the one who authorized the launch sequence. He had been the last person to run a manual check on the cryo systems before departure. His fingerprints were on every failsafe aboard this ship, and something had simply decided that those things no longer mattered. He went to the communications bay and pulled up the fleet channel. The Exodus mission had launched 10 ships, 10 identical vessels carrying 100,000 people total, each one following the same trajectory, the same timeline, the same destination. Protocol required all 10 ships to maintain regular contact throughout the journey. Automated pulses sent and received whether the crews were conscious or not. He initiated contact with ships 2 through 10. Silence, not static, not a weak signal degraded by distance. Complete total silence, as though the other 9 ships had simply ceased to exist. He pulled up the navigation logs and found the gaps almost immediately. Entire stretches of time where the ship's record-keeping had simply stopped. Hours that existed as blank space in the data. And then, scattered between the gaps, readings that his engineering background told him were flatly impossible. Velocity markers that exceeded anything in the human propulsion database by factors of 10, 20, 50. Energy signatures that matched no known fuel source. Course corrections executed with a precision that the ship's onboard system was not remotely capable of performing on its own. Someone had been flying this ship. Someone who was not human. He was still sitting at the console, running the numbers for the 4th time, when the descent alert sounded without warning. The ship had entered Proxima Centauri B's gravitational envelope and was already beginning atmospheric approach. He had not authorized it. He had not even been asked. The controls responded normally to his inputs. He could adjust pitch, modify the approach angle, tap the retro thrusters. But every time he attempted to alter the destination or abort the landing sequence, the system quietly ignored him and continued on its chosen course. They landed in a valley between 2 ridges of dark, metallic rock that absorbed light in a way that made them look almost liquid. He stood at the open airlock and took his first breath of alien air through his filtration mask, and the world outside hit him like something physical. The sky was the color of a dying ember, a deep red-black that sat too low, too heavy, the clouds moving in patterns that looked almost deliberate. Lightning cracked between the ridges constantly, not in single bolts, but in cascading sheets that lit the entire valley for 3 or 4 seconds at a time, before the darkness crushed back in. The gravity was wrong. He had been briefed on the expected surface gravity, slightly higher than Earth, manageable, nothing that would prevent normal activity. What he felt stepping down the ramp was something closer to wearing a suit of armor. Every movement required a small, specific effort. His legs worked harder than they should have just to keep him upright. He set up a basic perimeter camp and started taking readings. The atmosphere was technically breathable in short bursts without the filtration mask, though the particulate count was high enough to cause long-term pulmonary damage. Temperatures dropped by 40 degrees after dark. The electromagnetic interference from the constant lightning made long-range scanning nearly useless. On the 2nd day, something found him. He heard it before he saw it. A rhythm in the ground, a deep percussive impact that came faster and faster until the valley floor seemed to vibrate with it. He turned and saw it emerge from the shadow between 2 rock formations, and his body made the decision to run before his conscious mind had finished processing what he was looking at. It was enormous, 7 feet at the shoulder, maybe more, built like something that had spent 1,000,000 years being shaped by a world that was actively trying to kill everything on it. Dense, overlapping muscle, eyes set wide and deep, adapted for low light in a way that made them catch the constant lightning and reflect it back in pairs of silver flashes. It moved fast, far too fast for its size. He ran. He did not have a plan beyond run. He scrambled over the lower ridge and pressed himself into a crack in the rock face, pulling his legs in as the creature's weight came down on the exact spot where he'd been standing a moment before. The impact cracked the stone beneath it. It paused, sniffing the air, close enough that he could hear the wet sound of its breathing. Then it moved on. He stayed in the rock crack for 2 hours before he climbed out. On the 4th day, a section of his environment suit took a microfracture hit from a debris impact. Small fragments of superheated rock thrown up by one of the lower altitude lightning strikes. The oxygen system began bleeding. Not catastrophically, not immediately, but steadily, and he had no replacement components. He rationed his reserves and began moving faster, taking shorter rest periods, accepting the growing headache that came with slightly reduced oxygen as the price of staying mobile. On the 6th day, 2 hours after he had eaten the last of his emergency rations and was beginning to truly understand what it felt like to accept the possibility of dying, he dropped to his knees on a flat shelf of metallic rock and pressed his helmet against the cold surface and let himself think the thought he had been refusing to think for 6 days. They had escaped the end of the world. They had crossed 4 light years of nothing. They had done everything right. And they were going to die here anyway, on a planet that had never asked them to come, eaten slowly by an atmosphere and a gravity and 100 hostile variables that had no concept of human perseverance and no interest in it either. He was still kneeling when the scanner on his wrist blinked to life. A frequency, regular, repeating, artificial. He lifted his head. Natural systems did not produce regular repeating frequencies. Natural systems produced chaos, variation, the statistical noise of random physical processes. What he was reading on his scanner was structured, mathematical, intentional. He stood up, he oriented himself, he started walking. The source was 11 kilometers northwest, and it took him the better part of a day to cover the ground. The gravity and the headache and the terrain conspiring to cut his pace to something barely faster than a walk. But the signal grew stronger with every kilometer, and something about following it, having a direction and a purpose rather than simply surviving without context, was enough to keep him moving when stopping would have been so easy. He found the structures as the sky cycled through its brief version of twilight, the ember-colored clouds dropping to a deeper red before the lightning picked up and lit everything in strobing silver white. They rose from the valley floor in perfect geometric arrangement, not towers, not buildings in any human architectural sense, but forms that communicated intention as clearly as any skyline he had ever seen. The material was unlike anything in the human materials database. It was not metal, not stone, not composite, but something that seemed to share properties of all three while belonging to none of them. There was no visible damage from the constant lightning, no erosion from what must have been thousands of years of this brutal atmosphere. Nothing grew on or near the structures, and the creatures, the large ones, the fast ones, the ones that had been making the valley dangerous, they gave the area a wide berth, a quarter-mile radius at least. Whatever lived in this place commanded a respect that predators apparently understood instinctively. He walked through the entrance. Inside, the air was different, cleaner, warmer by a significant margin. The lighting came from no visible source, soft and even, the kind of illumination that made it hard to judge distance. The interior space was larger than it should have been given the exterior dimensions, much larger, which suggested the structures extended far below the surface, and it was silent in a way that felt active rather than empty, a silence that pressed in from all directions as though it was being maintained deliberately. He stood in the entrance for a long moment, and then said the most inadequate thing that has ever been said in the history of human contact with the unknown. "Hello? Hello, Earthling." He did not jump. He was too tired to jump. He turned toward the voice and found nothing. No figure, no screen, no visible source. The voice was coming from the air itself, from everywhere at once, and it was human in its syllables, its cadence, its tonal pattern, while being none of those things in any deeper way. It was a voice assembled from the concept of human speech rather than grown from it. "We come in peace," he said, "because some instincts are written deeper than rational thought." "We know," the voice said. "We brought you here." He closed his eyes for a moment. He had suspected it, somewhere in the back of his mind, since the navigation logs. But hearing it confirmed aloud was a different experience entirely. "Why?" he asked. They told him. It took a long time, and it came in pieces, the way you explain something complicated to someone who lacks most of the necessary framework to understand it. They had been watching humanity for a very long time, not with the detached scientific interest of researchers studying a specimen, but with the specific attention of those who have seen this particular pattern many times before, who know exactly how it ends, and who have not yet decided whether they want to prevent that ending or simply document it. The asteroid was not natural. It had been directed, not by them, but by something older, something that had been in this system long before either humans or their own species had developed the capacity for interstellar observation. There was a name for it in their language that translated poorly, but the closest approximation in English was something like the Arbiters, a civilization so old that the concept of their history was essentially meaningless to any intelligence that measured time in thousands rather than billions of years. And the Arbiters did not communicate. They did not negotiate. They evaluated, and then they acted. Their evaluation of humanity had concluded. Marcus stood in that clean, warm, impossible space and absorbed the fact that something ancient and incomprehensible had looked at his species, at 8 billion people, at every child and every piece of music and every stupid, beautiful, terrible thing human beings had ever built or burned, and had made a judgment. "Why didn't they just do it themselves?" he asked. "If they wanted us gone, why the asteroid? Why the indirect method?" "They always use indirect methods," the voice said. "They consider it more honest. A species that cannot survive its own solar system does not deserve the resources of another one." "And you disagree?" A pause, not a hesitation. They did not hesitate. He understood that already. But a pause for his benefit, to allow him to prepare for what came next. "We have disagreed before. It is not without cost. But you brought us here. You pulled us across 4 light years in 4 years. Why, if you're not sure about us?" Another pause. "Because of you," the voice said. "Specifically." He wanted to argue with that. He wanted to say that he was not special, that he was just a man who happened to be mission commander because he was good at logistics and crisis management and keeping his head clear under pressure, that whatever they thought they had seen in him was almost certainly a misreading of human data. But he was too tired to perform humility, and something in the way the voice said the word specifically stopped him. They had watched the Exodus mission from its planning stages. They had observed thousands of individual human beings through the preparation and selection process. And something about the pattern of his decisions, not his heroics, not his accomplishments, but his decisions, the small specific moments where he had chosen one thing over another, had distinguished him in a way they could not fully explain, which was significant, because they could explain most things. They made him an offer. The ship would return to Earth. They would accelerate it, as they had accelerated the outward journey. 4 years, not 50. And during the approach, they would arm the main propulsion system as a kinetic impactor, enough mass at enough velocity to destroy the asteroid completely on a direct intercept course. The ship would be lost. Everyone aboard would die, but the Earth would survive. That was the offer. He accepted, but he did not tell them everything. He had not been idle during the 6 days on the surface. Even dehydrated and oxygen depleted and hunted, he had been thinking. He had been thinking about Elena specifically, about the way she had pressed his hand against her stomach on their last day at the launch facility, her eyes doing that thing they did when she was trying to contain something too large to express in ordinary language, about the fact that she was asleep 200 meters away in a cryopod, and that the cells dividing quietly inside her had been doing so for 4 years already without knowing it. He asked if he could remain conscious for the return journey. They agreed. He did not tell them why he wanted to be awake. He allowed them to assume it was because he wanted to see the Earth again before the end, which was true as far as it went, and which contained within it something much more specific that he kept entirely to himself. 4 years is a very long time when you're the only conscious person on a ship. He learned faster than he had ever learned anything. The alien technology was not designed to be comprehensible to human minds, but it was also not designed to be incomprehensible. It was simply designed for a different kind of intelligence operating at a different kind of scale. And the gap, while enormous, was not absolute. He made mistakes constantly. He pursued dead ends for weeks at a time before finding a way around them. He slept 4 hours a night and spent the remaining 20 immersed in systems and materials and physical principles that had no names in any human language. He was building a ship, not the ship he was on. That one was already committed, its final trajectory a matter of orbital mechanics and the specific math of destruction. He was building something smaller, a lifeboat with an engine capable of things that human engineering would not independently develop for another 200 years. His calculations suggested it was possible. His calculations also had a confidence margin that left considerable room for him to be catastrophically wrong, and he was honest enough with himself to hold both of those things at the same time without letting the second one stop him from working on the first. He did not tell Elena. She was asleep. He visited her pod every day, standing in the dim amber light of the cryo bay, and updating her on things she couldn't hear. The work, the planet they'd left behind, the world they were going back to save. He told her about the creatures in the valley and the structures and the voice that came from everywhere at once. He told her the parts of the truth that he thought would make her feel brave. He did not tell her about the part where he was planning to die, or the part where he was planning not to. He finished the secondary vessel with 19 days to spare before the projected intercept window. It was not beautiful. It was functional in the way that things built by one person, alone, under extreme time pressure, using materials never intended for this purpose, tend to be functional, which is to say that it held together and it worked, and he was deeply uncertain about both of those things in equal measure. When the Earth appeared on the forward display, first as a pale point of light no different from any star, then gradually resolving into the blue-white disk he had last seen from the launch facility 4 years and a lifetime ago, he found that he had to stand very still for a moment before he could do anything else. And then he saw the asteroid. It was visible to the naked eye against the backdrop of stars. That was how close it was. That was how little time remained. A chunk of rock and iron larger than some of the smaller countries he had flown over in his old life. Dark and tumbling slowly and entirely indifferent to the fact that its trajectory was about to end something that had taken 4 billion years to produce. The moon hung in its usual position, and even at this distance he could see that the geometry was going to be precise and catastrophic. Not a near miss, not a grazing impact, but a direct hit that would shatter both bodies and scatter the debris across an orbital path that intersected the Earth's surface for decades. He reprogrammed the main ship. New course, direct intercept with the asteroid. Cryo-reactivation sequence, automatic, timed for 48 hours after his departure. Elena and every other person on that ship would wake up to a post-impact sky, to a crisis and a need, and a world that required rebuilding. But they would wake up. They would land. They would live. He sealed the connecting hatch between the main ship and the secondary vessel. He sat in the pilot seat of the thing he'd built with his own hands from alien materials and his own desperate mathematics. He ran the startup sequence. Everything nominal. He exhaled. He pushed off from the main ship and let the distance grow between them, watching the larger vessel recede in his rear display until it was just another point of light, and then nothing. He oriented the secondary vessel toward the asteroid. He accelerated. The first milestone was 0.2 times the speed of light, and at that point, the ship began making sounds it had not made before, a deep, structural groaning that he chose to interpret as the materials adjusting rather than the materials failing, because the alternative interpretation was not useful. The viewport showed him a star field stretched into thin lines, the light doing the things it does when you are moving through space fast enough to matter. 0.5 C. The structural sounds deepened into something that was more vibration than noise. His displays were beginning to flicker. He held course. 0.7 C. One of the secondary monitors failed entirely. He lost the telemetry feed from the asteroid's surface. Not that it mattered at this point, he was well past the range where that data was actionable. What mattered was his heading, and his heading was locked. 0.9 C. At 0.9 times the speed of light, the universe did something to his perception that he had no framework for. It was not pain, and it was not fear, and it was not beauty exactly, but it contained elements of all three. The stars ahead contracted into a single blazing point. The ship sang around him in frequencies he felt in his teeth and his sternum, and somewhere deeper than either. He thought about Elena. He thought about the specific weight of her hand in his, and the look she had given him at the launch facility, and the son or daughter he had not met yet, who would grow up on a planet that still had a moon and still had tides and still had everything it was supposed to have. He thought, if I am wrong about the math, I will not know it. He thought, if I am right, she will. He pushed the throttle beyond its designed maximum. White light. Absolute silence. 6 days later, the Exodus ship's cryo bay ran its reactivation sequence, and 90,999 people woke up to an Earth that was exactly as it had always been, with its moon intact and its oceans moving in their ancient rhythms, with no visible evidence of anything unusual having occurred in its immediate orbital vicinity. There was no debris field. There was no impact crater on the lunar surface. There was simply the Earth, turning on its axis, as it had been turning for 4.5 billion years, entirely unaware of how close it had come to the end. They searched for the asteroid for 3 days before concluding that no such object was present and that their records must have contained an error somewhere. The astronomical community that assembled in the weeks after landing to review the pre-Exodus impact models could not account for the discrepancy and eventually stopped trying. Some things, the consensus quietly decided, were better left as questions. A week after the landing, a small unscheduled vessel appeared in low Earth orbit. It was transmitting a standard human emergency beacon, outdated format, model of transponder that had been discontinued sometime in the previous decade, but recognizable. The orbital traffic controllers brought it down on a priority channel and had a medical team at the landing site within 20 minutes. Marcus Cole walked off the ramp under his own power, which surprised everyone who had expected a body. He was thinner than he'd been, the kind of thin that comes from a body running on determination and stored fat for longer than was comfortable. His eyes were doing something that people who encountered him in the days after landing would struggle to describe, focused and distant at the same time, like a man looking at the present moment from a very great height. Elena was in the medical queue when word reached her. She pushed through it in a manner that the medical staff found entirely understandable and chose not to impede. He had rehearsed what he was going to say. 4 years of relative solitude had given him considerable time to work on it. He had composed sentences and discarded them, and composed better ones and discarded those too, and had eventually arrived at a version that he felt was adequate to the weight of what needed to be communicated. He said none of it. Instead, he put both hands on her face, which was older than he remembered by exactly as much as 4 years should make it, and he pressed his forehead against hers and said very quietly, "I need to know." "His name is James," she said. "He's 3 years old. He's going to have your forehead and my terrible sense of direction, and he's currently asleep in the family holding bay and has no idea his father just fell out of the sky." He laughed. It surprised him. It was the kind of laugh that comes up from somewhere below the diaphragm without asking permission, and it sounded strange in his own ears after years of being the only person awake on a ship. 2 days later, at the hastily assembled council meeting convened to address the 1,000 urgent questions of rebuilding and beginning again, he stood up in front of 90,000-odd survivors of the human species and said what he had been thinking about how to say for 4 years. He told them about the structures on Proxima Centauri b. He told them about the voice and what it had said. He told them about the arbiters, which was the part that went very quiet and very still in the room. He told them that the judgment handed down against humanity had been based on what the species was, and not on what it was capable of becoming, and that the distinction, according to the only intelligence old enough to matter, was not yet settled. He told them that they had been watched, and that they were still being watched, and that the criteria for the next evaluation were the same as the criteria for every evaluation that had ever been conducted on every species across billions of years of cosmic history. Not capability, not intelligence, not technological advancement, but something slower and harder to measure, and ultimately more important than all of those. He told them that he had learned, in the specific school of 4 years alone with the mathematics of survival, and the certainty of death, and the experience of choosing love over logic, and then finding, against all reasonable expectation, that the math had worked out anyway. He had learned that there was a version of humanity that the universe might find worth keeping. "I have a lot to tell you," he said at the end, which was what he had planned to say and which turned out to be the truest thing he said all day. "But first, we need to change." He did not say what kind of change. He had been awake for 4 years with nothing to do but think, and he was smart enough to know that the most important things cannot be specified in advance. He just said the word and let it sit in the room and watched it land on 90,000 faces. In the sky above the assembly building, the moon rose in its usual arc, whole and silver and indifferent, throwing its familiar light across a world that still had everything it was supposed to have. And somewhere very far away, in a part of the universe that human instruments could not yet reach, Something ancient and patient, and utterly without sentiment, received a data point, added it to a record that spanned geological epochs, and waited.
So, that's the end of this story, but there are plenty of other great ones right here. Before you go, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that little bell.